Oh boy, have we got some to get through here. There's been quite a few of them, mainly because I've actually made some sort of progress on the book. Probably got around 4,000 words down, but they're not interlinking paragraphs. They're just randomly interspersed paragraphs that haven't been proofread or optimized or anything like that. So, it's mostly garbage. I never feel like I'm actually writing with the intention of what I'm writing. I kind of feel like I'm much like I used to write my essays for school or university or anything like that. I'd always just be trying to get words out just for word count's sake, and so most of it just ends up not being anything that you're trying to say. But whatever. I'm just going to get on with these because there are loads of them. Religious people and rationalist people share one fairly considerable thing in common. They both fear not understanding things. Perhaps fear isn't the right word, but you get the gist. The biggest difference, however, is that a rationalist approach is to seek to use verifiable techniques to understand the things they currently do not understand. The religious approach is to make false presumptions and effectively lie about what it doesn't understand, and subsequently incur all of the shortcomings associated with not understanding those things. So yes, neither of one of them likes not knowing. So, and one person decides, well, in order to avoid not knowing, I'm going to try and find out as much as I can using science and things like that. And the other people just go, well, I'm just going to make up an answer, and obviously they don't do that, but they turn to a made up answer and just kind of self-deceive themselves into believing that it's true, even though there is no evidence to believe it. Remembering my idea spurred by my encyclopedia story linked to that phenomenon where your mind reads something but you have no idea where you read it from, and it can take quite some time for you to see where you read it, and you have no recollection of doing so. Anyway, geez. Great sentence. The idea was that your mind is primed with certain ideas that predetermines, more like pre-limits, you to notice, presets almost? Predetermines more like pre-limits, you to notice certain things in your environment that you otherwise wouldn't. And I speculated that different people in different occupations are primed to notice different things, and I think this is true. But I don't think being primed in a certain way makes you a so-and-so, as in whatever occupation. Let's say a comedian is probably primed to notice peculiarity or quirkiness or some other more likely source for comedic interpretation. I do think that being primed in certain ways can make you a good so-and-so. And so, there are better and worse ways you can be primed for certain tasks. Perhaps depressed people are poorly primed for not being depressed, and are well primed for being depressed. And perhaps by training yourself to be primed differently, you can alleviate at least some of this depression. So, if you're convinced, it's cognitive bias basically is what it is. But if you're convinced that there's all these things wrong in the world, I've already done this one before, anyway, you're just going to be searching for those things to confirm your belief. The things we are losing as we come to realise the falsities of religion. Now obviously I am an atheist, sometimes stridently so, but I have become increasingly sympathetic to much of the evolutionarily harmonious aspects of religion and how these traditions cater favourably to some of our psychological needs. Sadly, the crimes and misapprehensions of religion are too many to be redeemed by these better qualities. However, it is salient to believe that we can incorporate at least some of the beneficial aspects of religion into our secular societies to great effect. When discussing something like religion, I would rather not know whether you are a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu and so on, and indeed rather that you didn't know that I was an atheist. My distaste of labels is so strong, I would in fact rather you didn't know or believe that you knew you were a Christian, Muslim, and so on. So, yeah, just as I don't really like to... Well, Sam bloody did this one as well, the bastard. Got all the good ideas. So maybe I'd never, maybe I can't take any credit for any of the ideas I have had. Anyway. Life worth living factor. That's what I'm kind of calling the eudaimonia scale now. I think because people always, I don't know what other people interpret. Maybe other people already have an idea in their head of eudaimonia, and I think what I'm really trying to say is just a life worth living factor. So as that factor increases, your life is objectively more worth living, and that's what we're trying to increase across time. Reality emulators. What allows us to make predictions about the future. So our minds as reality emulators. It's what allows us to make predictions about the future and imagine what it would be like if the past had gone differently. Storytellers are certainly very good at this. Dostoevsky with Crime and Punishment, for example. And then if I wrote this out, I kind of expanded on this on my book thing, so there's a bit more information there and some clarifications and stuff. And they're also if-then emulators, so that's what allows us to tolerate / buy into entirely fictitious fantasies. So obviously worlds with dragons and stuff. You might think it might seem like how can we possibly relate to that if we're just emulating things in our mind, or if their job is to emulate things to teach us things about reality. What's the point of the fantasy? And it's a kind of if-then scenario. So if there were dragons that had all this power, then it would teach you how to behave, because there are certain things which aren't really that easy to put into stories without them being as complicated as they are in the real world. So it's good to simplify things. So like a big, the evil. Well, this is what Jordan's always gone about with his archetypes and stuff. Anyway, if you embody something into like a collective behavior or psychological trait or something into an objectively evil being, then you can, teach about what's wrong. Anyway, into like a dragon or something, right? Whatever. Imagine you are someone who isn't convinced by my arguments, or don't imagine if this happens to be a reality for you. What would you give as your reason for not living what would be considered an immoral life? You steal, you murder, etc. That's the immoral examples. In fact, this isn't dissimilar to what people of faith argue a true atheist would do. Presumably, you don't do these bad things because you have been told they are wrong. This is the most typical person who thinks that they don't behave immorally just because they've been told not to, and that's the reason they give. But why not do them anyway? Just because you've been told not to, why not do them? Well, just because you've been told something's wrong, it doesn't mean you have to do it. Well, you could choose to just do all the things you've been told to do wrong, and some people do that. So that's not really your reason that you don't do them. That's just, there's a correlation with the things you do and don't do, and the things you've been told not to do and not to do. Things you've been told to do and not to do. This is not a rhetorical question. Why not do them? This is not a rhetorical question. I suggest that the reason you don't do these things is because it likely isn't in your interest to do so. For example, let's say you believe that it would be in your best interest to do these immoral things, and the only reason you don't do them is because some authority tells you not to. So you murder someone. And then I was going to go on this big thing about how this actually pans out in the world, but then I realised this is exactly what I was talking about with Crime and Punishment. So what Dostoevsky has done is he's run the emulation for us, presumably because good writers have better reality emulators in their mind. Their minds are better reality emulators than ours, than the average person. And so they do the legwork for us. They do this running simulation, and then so that people don't have to conduct the actual experiment in real life, where it's hard to get all the information and stuff. And you can try to capture, and there can all be all kinds of complications that aren't going to be the norm. Some Nigeria, 1-0. Yes, so Dostoevsky, I haven't actually read it, I should admit, but I plan to. Tries to show you all the things that will happen even in the most perfect case of a murder where it would seem justified, and how it can all still go incredibly wrong. So yeah, and actually I just finished reading The Picture of Dorian Gray, and it's a similar thing. So I write about it not quite well, but I wrote a bit about it in the book thing that I'm doing. And how even when he kind of, Dorian supposedly, well, Oscar Wilde suggests that evil people wear their evilness, or wear the scars of their evil acts on, not literal scars, but kind of literal, but not scars, on their face and their body and their emotions and stuff. and Dorian is by basically magic free of that. So he's basically free to be immoral without incurring any of the negative consequences of his immoral actions. But even then, it turns out his own conscience still suffers, and so it doesn't work out well for him in the end. So there you go. That Khan guy, I just came across this Khan guy, and he's like the first rapper I've been really impressed with for a really long time. I don't actually listen to rap that often, if I'm honest, but yeah, I just really liked some of his songs. Obviously, there's a little bit I don't like, for all the obvious reasons that I've pointed out that many times. I don't like the N-word used liberally. What the fuck is the word I'm looking for? Anyway, liberally. Jesus Christ, Ollie, what an idiot! The N-word being used quite so liberally, and it would seem he's quite a holy person, not holy but religious. But yeah, his lyricism is very good, very good, and obviously the speed, which I like. So yeah, I think he actually, for me personally, even though I know absolutely nothing about it, he rivals Eminem. So, which I'm glad to see, because it's nice to have people right at the top. I reckon Childish Gambino also got pretty close with in terms of lyricism with things like Bonfire and stuff like that. They were really good, but I don't really like Donald Glover all that much as a person. So maybe I wouldn't like Khan either. Maybe I wouldn't like actually I kind of like Eminem because he does some comedy stuff and seems like he kind of doesn't take himself too seriously. But Childish Gambino takes himself very seriously, very seriously. And also Khan raps a couple of times about suicide and stuff. So yeah, that's a win for me. If I'm such a strong advocate of fiction and even fantasy, why do I oppose religion? And this is the reason: because religion does not admit to its fictitiousness. It masquerades as reality and subsequently perpetuates harmful lies. Becoming a pure contemplative is objectively selfish, not in the way that I would defend, but in the way that it is not. But in the way that it is not, or rather should not be, allowed to be in the self-interest of those who seek this path. I don't know about this anymore. It seemed like, well, I dislike it because of the it's you can't really say it's not even negative sum, because you really can just go out of the, I guess it's kind of negative sum because you've cost your parents and stuff and society a bit when you were in your infancy, but you have no choice over that. It's kind of negative sum, but it's really not. It's kind of, well, it's not. It's kind of zero sum. So actually neutral, but zero sum suggests a winner and a loser, and there isn't really that. It's just a kind of, it's like not playing the game at all. But when you could be positive sum, it's almost, I don't know. Anyway, self-interest of the CBR is not conducive to positive sum relationships and symbiosis. However, if it is possible to escape this judgment, which I may somewhat be having to invent, the judgment I'm just expressing now, it is an entirely viable route. Possible to have a higher and lower life worth living factor, and we know of many ways to increase it. Okay, that's great. It would look something like this. What the fuck? It would look something, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, so this is the life worth living factor, so this is just something you can do. It would look something like this. A person who is on the verge of bankruptcy, has a history of crime and abusive relationships, has no healthy relationships whatsoever, or meaningful exploits, or job prospects, and is suffering from a clinical mental health condition, and who has not been made aware of any path to a more intrinsic source of well-being, commonly associated with the spiritual. This person, as I have described them, is likely to have a rather negative LWLF, life worth living factor. As soon as you abbreviate it, you turn into, or acronym it, you turn into a right wanker. Which is to say, if their life were not to undergo drastic changes in circumstances and understanding, it would be better for them not to be alive at all. Conversely, A person with fewer known psychological stresses. Perhaps they have a steady job in which they have some degree of autonomy, some meaningful hobbies and relationships, a sufficient income to provide them with food and shelter, and that would be enough to bolster them in case of some financial emergency, and on top of all this, had found a route to experiences less reliant of fulfilling desires, say through meditation. This person would likely have a suitably positive LWLF, and it would not be particularly rational to prematurely end their life. An action conducted by another individual can either be in your self-interest, opposed to your self-interest, or neutral. Forget whether or not you believe this is the correct framework for assessing ethics for a moment. We are stating logically coherent facts. I'm doing it. I'm not necessarily doing it. But anyway, that's just, I don't see how you can dispute that. It can either be one of the three, right? So, when someone tries to murder you, even if the act of murdering you would be euphoric for them, it can either be in, against, or have no impact on your self-interest. I would suggest that it is most likely not in your self-interest, although given the topic of this book, perhaps I should replace murder with torture. However, its specific relation to your self-interest doesn't actually matter for what I'm about to say. This other agent's action can bear one of these three correlations with your objective, in brackets, self-interest, and which one it does will determine what action will be most appropriate for you to undertake. Assuming that it is not in your self-interest for them to murder/torture you, there are certain actions and non-actions which will result in them being able to impose this malefaction on you or not. It is your imperative to enact that combination of actions or non-actions that will be in your self-interest. This may include, but is not limited to, physically preventing them from murdering you, or verbally convincing them that attempting to murder you will not be the best for them. So you're basically trying to convince them that it's not in their self-interest. Even if you enact violence, then the only thing you're trying to do with that violence is convince them that it's not in their self-interest to do it. Right? Well, you're actually trying to incapacitate them, but it's essentially the same thing. The reason a kind of hedonism, which focuses on immediate satisfaction and pleasure, is not what we are looking for, is because it doesn't maximize eudaimonia across time. In each moment, all we can hope is that the us of our past has made sufficient effort to prepare us, and the initial us was in quotations, of our past has made sufficient effort to prepare us and our environment to make our present experience tolerable. It seems obvious that we, in the present, should have a similar relationship to our future selves. This is complicated slightly by the realization that our traditional sense of self, especially a sense of self across time, disintegrates under close inspection. However, an assumption is made. You can choose, really. You can try to maximize it across time or try to maximize it in the immediate, but as soon as you realize that you're always the immediate one, you're always you're a moment-to-moment self, right? But you being conscious is the constant, right? There you go. Depression as a negative positive feedback loop. Depression could be like anger. As Sam says, it is impossible to remain angry for any considerable length of time without thinking thoughts which justify your anger. So too, it might be impossible to remain depressed without thinking thoughts which justify your depression. Not the case for all types of depression, but certainly for some. So, I think this might actually be the case for me, really. Well, if you're the kind of person who's making notes 24/7 about why your life isn't worth living and why you'd be right to commit suicide, then maybe if you could just stop thinking, because I've said before, I'm not sure how much I believe this, but I'm going all in on it right now, this second, that mental health, or not being depressed, is just, there's no difference from being depressed other than not thinking depressed thoughts. And obviously that isn't the case for some cases of depression where there really is I don't know if things like schizophrenia are a class of depression, but I imagine they're far more torturous. Anywho, I'm going to pause it here and restart a new one just so it's not too long to send. Okay, back in a minute. I'm back in a minute. Well, I'm back now, and it hasn't been a minute. Okay. I wonder if there is a concise common theme to all mental health disorders. Johann Hari went some way to suggesting they are all variations of connections being lost, and needs not being met. He didn't say this is the case for all, but certainly a seeming correlation. There is a seeming correlation. I wonder if certain things like OCD and hypochondria are a miscalibration of our reactions to how well in the case of OCD, our immediate environment fits our mental model of what a perfect environment should look like. In the case of hypochondria, people notice any slight deviation from this perfect model of health in their mind as a serious or urgent issue. Depressed people perhaps see any deviation from a perfect society or life circumstances in the same way. So yeah, you have this kind of mental model of what the perfect whatever would be. So OCD, your environment; hypochondria, your body and health and stuff; and depression, just society. Well, your life, I guess. And these mental health disorders, I wonder if they're characterized by not necessarily an overreaction. I think that maybe the reason depression is increasing so much is that there are so many things wrong with society at the moment, and there's one thing being primed to notice these depressing things, which is what I was talking about earlier, and you can just change that. But it's another thing to just live in a miserable existence. Obviously, we live in far better, as books like Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now have shown us that we're living in the best time of human history. But so we wouldn't quite be justified in that. But when we're exposed to it far more, so we're being bombarded with depressing thoughts, things like the media and stuff like that, and then you enter that negative positive feedback loop of looking for the very things that and that might not be representative of the actual occurrence. Anyway, just an idea that all that was just ideas, so just ignore them. Some things, circumstances, situations, events and interactions, are almost undoubtedly going to give rise to certain thought patterns and thus negative positive feedback loops, and so we should try to minimize the likelihood of these things occurring without destabilizing the fundamental structure of society. However, we should also be aware that it isn't necessarily impossible to escape these loops, although it will almost certainly be more difficult in some cases than others. To use one of Sam's thought experiments, although he only used it expressly to make a point about how certain conversations aren't able to be had in certain circles, why don't we eat babies? Why is it bad to eat babies? I would hope it was obvious by now that my answer is because it won't be best for you. But I think the reason we feel that it's bad, or rather why not eating babies is good, is because we have developed certain psychological commonalities, and any indication that one or some of these commonalities isn't functioning normally, or isn't present at all is an indication that one or many others could be similarly affected. I think this may be a similar reason. Well, it's kind of like how they've been socialised, right? If you see someone doing something that most well-socialised people don't do, then you're unsure of how well-socialised they've been in other domains. So people going around shouting in the street might not know not to be violent, right? Anyway, I think this may be a similar reason we don't trust people who talk to themselves openly in public. There we go. Essentially, not eating babies, not that I'm conflating eating babies with talking to oneself, is a kind of virtue signalling. See Sam's podcast with someone, whatever his name, Hansen, I think it was Hansen, and his book about the elephant in the room or something like that, about the real reasons we do and believe the things we do. The reason anger is so... Oh, no, I didn't like that one. That was rubbish. I was thinking about cogito ergo sum. And obviously I know literally nothing about Latin, although cogito is close to cognito. So it's meant to be I think therefore I am. But I'm wondering whether it could be something like cognizance entails existence. Because that would be... It doesn't really matter. It makes no difference. I was thinking about how our morality, and how we develop morality is similar to how we train dogs with treats, etc. We train dogs with treats to teach them good and bad, right from wrong, etc. It's similar to humans in that they have some innate morality that has co-evolved with our own, but not completely. But it's not completely innate, much like human children. So human children generally have some degree of morality, and puppies will have some degree of morality as well, like playing. That's one way they develop it. But when you're trying to teach a dog not to bark at the postman or something, you might have a water pistol or something to spray it when it barks, so to try and deter it from doing the thing you don't want it to do, and the treats for getting it to do the things that you do want to do. So when it sits or something like that, you give it a treat. And essentially what you're doing, you can do this with anything really, so I don't want to rely too heavily on this, but you're trying to show it what's best for it, and both in the immediate. Okay, got interrupted there by a phone call there. Just going to finish up there. What was I saying? Something about morality. Give them a treat. Right, so both you're trying to show them it's both in their immediate self-interest to not bark, because every time they do, you're going to go at them. You're teaching them morality, right? Or at least your idea of morality. Because it's not in your interest for them to do the thing like barking. Anyway, Jesus Christ. And give them a treat when they sit, because it's in your interest for them to follow your orders, and then you're teaching them that it's in their interest to follow your orders, because when they do, they get the same.